August 9, 1943. A newsstand in New York City. A man in a fedora picks up the latest issue of Time magazine. Staring back at him from the cover is the rugged, battle-hardened face of Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen. The caption practically screams American heroism. The article inside describes a military genius, man whose 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, is sweeping through Sicily, crushing German panzer divisions and saving the Allied invasion from disaster. To the American public, Terry Allen is the future of the war. He is the pattern of the infantry, a rising star, destined for history books. But there is a twist that the man at the newsstand doesn't know. In fact, nobody reading that magazine knows the truth. By the time that issue hit the streets, the hero on the cover had already been fired. 2 days earlier, in a dusty command tent in Sicily, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley looked Terry Allen in the eye and stripped him of his command. He didn't fire him for losing. He didn't fire him for incompetence. He fired him essentially because his soldiers were too wild, too dirty, and too good at killing to remember how to salute properly. While America celebrated Allen as its greatest combat leader, the Army was quietly shipping him home in disgrace. This isn't just a story about a general losing his job. It is the story of the greatest comeback in the history of the U.S. Army. It is the story of a man who was told he was broken, who was thrown onto the scrap heap, and who responded by building a new division that didn't just fight the Germans, it terrified them. This is the story of Terry Allen and the revenge of the night fighters. To understand why Terry Allen became the Army's ultimate outcast, we have to understand the Army itself. In the first half of the 20th century, it was a small, insular club dominated by West Point graduates who valued 2 things above all else: order and uniformity. Terry Allen was the antithesis of both. Born into a military family, Allen seemed destined for the uniform. Yet the academic rigors of West Point rejected him, suffered from severe dyslexia, in an era when no one knew what that was. He didn't just struggle. He failed. He flunked out of the academy not once but twice. In the eyes of the institution, he was already a washout. But Allen possessed a stubbornness that bordered on delusion. He enrolled in Catholic University, joined the ROTC, and sneaked into the officer corps through a side door in 1912. The Ringknockers, the West Point elite, looked down on him as an imposter. Then came the First World War. While the parade ground generals obsessed over maps and French chateaux, Captain Terry Allen was in the mud. He led from the front, a cigarette dangling from his lip, ignoring regulations that said battalion commanders should stay safe. At the Meuse-Argonne, a machine gun bullet shattered his jaw and teeth. Most men would have gone home. Allen escaped the hospital, bandaged his own face, and returned to the line. Couldn't speak, so he scrawled orders on a notepad and led his men into the fire. By the time the war ended, 2 things were clear. First, Terry Allen was a natural-born killer who understood the chaotic flow of infantry combat better than anyone with a diploma. Second, he was a nightmare for his superiors. He drank hard, ignored uniforms. He treated the Army manual like a suggestion box. During the interwar years, the U.S. Army shrank, and officers like Allen usually faded away. But he survived, bouncing between cavalry posts, getting into trouble, and somehow charming his way out of it. He was the bad boy of the officer corps belle by his soldiers, tolerated by his peers, and loathed by the disciplinarians. By 1940, with the world on fire again, Allen was a lieutenant colonel on the verge of being court-martialed for yet another infraction. His career should have ended there. But George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, intervened. Marshall was a cold, calculating judge of talent. He kept a famous black book of officer names. He knew that when the fighting started, the Army would need thugs, not just administrators. He promoted Allen to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. It was a shock to the system. But Marshall gave Allen the crown jewel of the Army, command of the 1st Infantry Division. Hey, the Big Red One. Allen molded them in his image: tough, arrogant, and aggressive. But he was about to run headfirst into a man who represented the exact opposite philosophy of war: Omar Bradley. The conflict between Omar Bradley and Terry Allen wasn't just personal. It was ideological. Bradley was the GI's general, but he was also a schoolteacher at heart. He believed that discipline in the rear led to efficiency at the front. He believed in clean uniforms, sharp salutes, and seamless cooperation between units. Allen believed in winning. In North Africa, the 1st Infantry Division was a force of nature. They fought harder and died in greater numbers than any other unit. But they also left a trail of chaos. They looted wine shops. They got into fistfights with MPs. They mocked soldiers from other divisions. When Bradley took command of the 2nd Corps, he was appalled. He saw the Big Red One not as an elite fighting force, but as a mob of armed hooligans. Bradley wrote in his diary that Allen's division was unmanageable. He criticized Allen for being too close to his men, for ignoring the finer points of military courtesy. But then came the German counterattacks. At Kasserine Pass, where other American units dissolved in panic, Allen's men stood their ground like a stone wall. When the chips were down, the hooligans were the only ones holding the line. This dynamic reached its breaking point during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. The landing at Gela was a bloodbath. The elite Hermann-Gring Panzer Division launched a massive counterattack, driving 90 tanks straight at the beaches. The Americans had no tanks of their own yet. It was infantry against armor. Allen's men didn't run. They fought with bazookas, artillery, and sheer desperation. They stopped the panzers in the surf. Even Bradley had to admit that no other division could have saved the invasion that day. But gratitude in the army is short-lived. As the campaign dragged on, the 1st Division pushed inland toward Troina, a mountain fortress held by the hardest core of the German army. The battle for Troina was a meat grinder. For 6 days, Allen threw his battalions against entrenched machine gun nests and artillery observers. The heat was unbearable. The casualties were horrific. But Allen, often seen walking the lines with his men, willed them forward. On August 6th, Troina fell. It was a magnificent victory, arguably the hardest-fought battle of the entire campaign. The next morning, Allen was summoned to Bradley's headquarters. He likely expected a commendation. Instead, Bradley relieved him of command. The firing of Terry Allen was a thunderclap. Bradley's justification was vague. He claimed the division needed a rest, and that Allen had become too individualistic. He also fired Allen's deputy, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. The message was brutal. Tactical victory does not excuse bad behavior. We have to pause and analyze this decision. From a modern perspective, it looks insane. You don't fire your best combat general immediately after his biggest win. But Bradley was looking at the big picture of coalition warfare. He felt that Allen's arrogance was infecting the entire command structure. Bradley feared that the 1st Division was becoming a private army that only listened to its mob boss, Terry Allen. However, the timing suggests something more personal. Bradley was a methodical, by-the-book planner. Allen was an instinctive, chaotic genius. Allen made Bradley uncomfortable, made him look stiff. By firing Allen, Bradley was asserting dominance over the culture of the American army. He was declaring that the era of the cowboy general was over. Allen was devastated. He was sent back to the States, humiliated, forced to smile for the cameras while the press hailed him as a hero, unaware that his career was supposedly over. Terry Allen sat in El Paso, Texas, waiting for retirement. But George Marshall wasn't done with him. Marshall looked at the situation in Europe. The Allies were bogged down in the hedgerows of Normandy. German artillery and machine guns were exacting a terrible toll. Daylight attacks were suicide. Marshall needed a general who could think differently. In October 1943, Marshall did the unthinkable. He handed Terry Allen another division, the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves. But this was not the Big Red One. These weren't veterans. They were draftees, clerks, farm boys, and high school graduates who had never held a rifle. Allen had to build them from scratch, and this is where Terry Allen proved he wasn't just a brawler, he was a visionary. Allen had learned a bloody lesson in North Africa and Sicily. Fighting the Germans in daylight was stupid. German tactical doctrine relied on superior interlocking fields of fire. If they could see you, they could kill you. So, Allen decided to take away their eyes, began training the Timberwolves to be creatures of the night. Standard Army doctrine allocated perhaps 8 hours a week to night training. Allen ramped it up to 35 hours. The 104th Division lived in the dark. They slept during the day and trained when the sun went down, This wasn't just marching in the dark. It was a total sensory rewiring. Allen forbade flashlights. He forbade shouting. His men learned to communicate with clicks, touches, and whispers. They learned to navigate dense forests by the feel of the ground and the position of the stars. They learned to assemble their weapons, treat wounds, and read maps without a single photon of light. Allen was ruthless. He knew that to survive the night, his men had to own it. He was creating a division of phantoms. When the Timberwolves arrived in Europe in late 1944, they were unlike any other unit on the Western Front. While other divisions dug in at dusk, the Timberwolves stood up. Their debut in Holland was spectacular. Moving through flooded, freezing terrain, they launched a series of night attacks that shattered German lines. The Germans were terrified. Their defensive manuals assumed attacks would come at dawn. The Timberwolves struck at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., moving silently until they were right on top of the enemy foxholes. But the real test came at the Siegfried Line, the West Wall. These were concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth, and pre-sighted kill zones that had stopped the Allied advance cold. Allen unleashed the Timberwolves. In battle after battle, Weissweiler, the Roe River, the 104th attacked under the cover of darkness. They bypassed strong points, infiltrated rear areas, and caused chaos in the German command structure. German prisoners of war asked their captors, "When do you people sleep?" They started calling the 104th the Night Fighters. Allen's revenge wasn't loud, it was methodical. Every town captured, every bunker cleared, was a silent rebuttal to Omar Bradley. Bradley had said Allen couldn't discipline men. Yet here was the 104th executing the most disciplined. Complex maneuvers of the war fighting in total darkness, without shooting each other under Allen's command. This brings us to a crucial piece of analysis that is often overlooked. What Terry Allen achieved with the 104th Division was arguably more impressive than what he did with the Big Red One. With the 1st Division, he had veterans, led by charisma and guts. But with the 104th, he led by system. Historians often debate whether Allen's firing was necessary. Some argue that Bradley was right, that the 1st Division was out of control. But looking at the 104th, we see that Allen was capable of immense discipline when it had a purpose. The unruly behavior of the Big Red One wasn't a failure of Allen's leadership. It was a symptom of their exhaustion and the specific culture of that unit. When given a fresh canvas, Allen painted a masterpiece of order. So psychological pressure on Allen during this period must have been crushing. Imagine the fear of failure. If the 104th had failed, if they had broken in their first battle, Allen would have gone down in history as a fluke, a one-hit wonder who got lucky in Africa. Every night attack was a gamble. Night operations are notoriously difficult to control. One wrong turn, one radio failure, and units start firing on each other. Allen wasn't just fighting the Germans, he was fighting the ghosts of his own reputation. He had to suppress his natural urge to be the wild man, and instead become the conductor of an invisible symphony. He stayed in his command post, tracking movements by radio, trusting the training he had instilled. This required a level of restraint that Bradley never believed Allen possessed. In a twist of irony, the 104th became one of the most disciplined divisions in the theater. They didn't loot, didn't brawl. They just killed efficiently in the dark. Allen had proven that he could play by the rules, as long as he could write the tactical playbook. Most histories of the 104th focus on the maps, the arrows moving forward, but we need to stop and look at the experience of the night attack, a reality that history books rarely convey. Fighting at night in 1944 was not like fighting at night today. There were no night vision goggles, no thermal optics, no GPS. When the sun went down, the battlefield became a void. Now, for the young soldiers of the Timberwolves, the psychological strain was immense. Humans are diurnal creatures. We're hardwired to fear the dark. Allen was asking his 19-year-old draftees to walk voluntarily into that fear. Veterans of the 104th described the sensation of absolute isolation. Even if your buddy was 3 feet away, you couldn't see him. You were alone with the sounds of war, the snap of a twig, the metallic click of a bolt, the scream of an incoming shell. The mental discipline required to keep moving forward, to not fire blindly at shadows, was superhuman. Allen understood this psychology. He introduced artificial moonlight, bouncing searchlights off the cloud cover to create a dim, diffuse glow. It wasn't enough to see clearly, but it was enough to create silhouettes. It turned the battlefield into a surreal, ghostly landscape where the Timberwolves hunted. There is an overlooked tactical brilliance here. By attacking at night, Allen neutralized the German MG-42 machine gun, the deadliest infantry weapon of the war. An MG-42 crew needs a target. In the dark, they were firing blind. The Timberwolves would slip through the gaps in the spray, get within grenade range, and end the fight before the Germans knew it had started. But the cost of this style of warfare was a unique kind of trauma. The Timberwolves lived in a world of constant hypervigilance. They couldn't relax. Every shadow was a threat. The stress of night combat burned men out faster than daylight. Fighting because the adrenaline never spiked and dropped. It stayed at a constant sickening hum. Allen knew this. He cycled his units carefully, acting as a protective father figure to men who were operating on the edge of sanity. He wasn't just their general. He was the anchor in the dark. By April 1945, the Timberwolves had pierced deep into Germany. They had crossed the Rhine and were racing toward the Elbe River to link up with the Russians. They were unstoppable. But on April 11, near the town of Nordhausen, the night fighters encountered a darkness that no amount of training could prepare them for. They discovered the Mittelbudora concentration camp complex. This wasn't a battlefield, it was a factory of death. The prisoners here had been forced to build V-2 rockets in underground tunnels, literal creatures of the dark. Worked to death without sunlight, the Timberwolves found thousands of corpses stacked like cordwood. They found skeletons barely breathing, men who had been reduced to less than nothing. For the soldiers of the 104th who had spent 6 months mastering the night, this was a perversion of everything they knew. They had used darkness as a weapon of war. The Nazis had used it as a tool of extermination. Terry Allen, the tough old cavalryman who had seen everything from the trenches of WWII to the deserts of Africa, was shaken. He ordered the local German civilians to come to the camp. He made them bury the dead. He forced them to look at what their nation had done. It was the only time the terrible Terry facade cracked, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. Days later, the 104th reached the Mule River. On April 26th, it made contact with the Soviet army. The war in Europe was effectively over. Timberwolves had been in combat for 195 consecutive days. They had never yielded ground. They'd never failed to take an objective. The division that was supposed to be a consolation prize for a washed-up general had become one of the most effective killing machines of World War II. When the war ended, Terry Allen didn't get a ticker-tape parade, quietly retired to El Paso. But his legacy had been cemented in a way that medals couldn't capture. Omar Bradley went on to become the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is remembered as the soldier's general. But military historians today often look back and ask, who was the better combat leader? Bradley was the manager the army needed to organize millions of men. But Terry Allen was the warrior the army needed to win the fights that mattered. The tragedy of Terry Allen is that he was a man out of time, who was a throwback to the days of cavalry charges and individual heroism, forced to operate in an era of industrial corporate warfare. Bradley fired him because he didn't fit the mold. But Marshall saved him because he knew that when the mold breaks, you need a man who can fight with a broken bottle in the dark. Allen never publicly criticized Bradley. He didn't have to. The record of the 104th Infantry Division spoke for him. He took a group of green draftees and turned them into the night fighters, a unit that German generals listed as one of the ones they feared most. In the end, the undisciplined general proved that true discipline isn't about how well you salute. It's about how well you perform when the sun goes down, when the officers aren't watching. And when the only thing standing between victory and death is the trust you have in the man next to you. Terry Allen passed away in 1969. But somewhere in the history of the U.S. Army, his spirit is still there, a reminder that sometimes the best man for the job is the one who refuses to follow the rules.